On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, the world changed forever, not with a declaration or a formal ceremony, but with the thunderous roar of German bombers screaming across the Polish sky, their payloads raining down on the city of Wielan in a coordinated strike that would mark the opening salvo of the deadliest conflict in human history. In that singular moment, as explosions tore through sleeping neighborhoods and civilians stumbled from their homes in shock and confusion, the prophecy that Winston Churchill would later make came true. This is not a drill. This is the real thing. What followed over the next 10 days would reshape the entire world, introducing warfare on a scale never before imagined, demonstrating the terrifying efficiency of modern military technology, and setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately claim over 60 million lives. But this story doesn't begin with the bombs. It begins much earlier, in the twisted corridors of European politics, in the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, and in the rise of a man whose rhetoric of national glory and racial superiority would transform the continent into a battlefield. Adolf Hitler had long made his ambitions clear, not in whispers, but in speeches broadcast across Germany. In his book Mein Kampf, that lay on tables in thousands of homes, and in the rearmament programs he launched in defiance of international treaties that supposedly bound the German nation. The Western powers, Britain, France, and even America, watched with a mixture of concern and hope, believing that negotiation, appeasement, and economic cooperation might yet prevent the catastrophe that haunted their memories of the First World War. But Hitler was not a man interested in negotiation. He was a visionary in his own distorted mind, convinced that Germany's destiny lay in the conquest of Eastern Europe, in the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people, and in the subjugation or elimination of those he deemed racially inferior. In August of 1939, just days before the invasion of Poland, Hitler signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, a shockingly cynical agreement that carved up Eastern Europe between two supposed enemies and stunned the world. Surely now, many thought, the Western powers would finally stand firm against German expansion, but they did not yet understand the gravity of what was about to unfold. As August turned to September, the German military machine, the Wehrmacht, had positioned itself along the Polish border with meticulous precision. Nearly 2 million troops organized into army groups under the command of seasoned generals, supported by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, which boasted over 2,000 aircraft, many equipped with cutting-edge technology that Polish pilots could barely match. The Poles, by contrast, fielded a brave but substantially outmatched force of roughly 400,000 soldiers, many of them cavalry units on horseback, armed with rifles and determination, but lacking the tanks, aircraft, and coordinated command structure that the Germans possessed in abundance. On that fateful September 1st, as German bombers struck Wielan without warning or declaration of war, a violation of international convention that shocked even the cynical diplomats of Europe, Polish defenders scrambled to their positions, unaware that this was not a limited incursion or a provocation, but the beginning of a coordinated, all-encompassing military operation designed to destroy Poland as a nation within a matter of weeks. The German strategy, which would later be perfected and become known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, relied on speed, surprise, and the concentration of force in narrow sectors to break through enemy lines, followed by rapid exploitation of those breakthroughs by armored columns that would encircle and destroy isolated pockets of resistance before they could coordinate a defense. General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of this new form of warfare, commanded the 19th Corps, which was equipped with the latest panzer tanks, machines that represented a quantum leap in armored technology, and were supported by coordinated airstrikes, artillery, and motorized infantry in a synchronized dance of destruction that the Poles had no doctrine, training, or equipment to counter. Within hours of the invasion's start, the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority over Polish territory, destroying dozens of Polish aircraft on the ground and in the air, giving the Germans a crucial advantage that allowed their bombers to range freely across the Polish landscape, striking military installations, airfields, railroads, and civilian populations with impunity. The Polish Air Force, though fighting with extraordinary courage, was quickly overwhelmed and effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force within the first few days, leaving Polish ground forces to face not only a numerically superior enemy, but also an enemy that could attack them from the skies without fear of interception. In Warsaw, the capital city, government officials and military commanders received the news of the invasion with a mixture of grim determination and dawning horror. They knew Poland could not defeat Germany in a direct military contest, but they also knew that to surrender without fighting would be unthinkable, a betrayal of everything their nation represented after just over 2 decades of independence following the collapse of the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and German empires in the First World War. Poland's military strategy, such as it was, relied on holding the line along the border long enough for Britain and France to mobilize their forces and launch an offensive against Germany from the west, an assumption that would prove tragically mistaken, as the British and French, despite the clear violation of German aggression, moved with agonizing slowness in their response. On September 3rd, 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France finally declared war on Germany. But the declaration was a formality. Their armies were not ready. Their generals were not prepared to launch an immediate offensive, and the window of opportunity to relieve pressure on Poland by attacking Germany from the rear was already closing. The Polish army, though initially mounting fierce resistance and scoring some tactical successes against the advancing Germans, found itself fighting a two-front war by September 17th, when the Soviet Union, honoring the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded from the east, crushing any hope of organized Polish resistance and condemning the nation to partition between the two totalitarian powers that had agreed to carve it up like a carcass between two predators. But these 10 days saw far more than just military operations and strategic calculations. They witnessed the introduction of a new form of warfare that would define the conflict: the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, the use of terror as a weapon of conquest, and the erasing of the distinction between the battlefield and the home front that had supposedly existed in previous conflicts. German bombers struck not just military targets but cities filled with civilians. They bombed hospitals. They attacked refugee columns. They dropped leaflets followed by explosives, spreading terror and chaos that made coherent defense even more difficult than the military disparity would have already dictated. The Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers, equipped with screaming sirens designed to create psychological terror, became the symbol of this new, ruthless form of warfare. They would descend on their targets with a terrifying shriek, release their bombs with devastating accuracy, and pull up at the last possible moment, leaving behind destruction and a population traumatized by the experience of warfare that came from above, from an enemy that could not be directly opposed or fought. Civilians fled the advancing armies in vast columns, clogging roads and making them targets for air attack, creating scenes of human misery that would become the defining image of this new war. Families torn apart, children separated from parents in the chaos, refugees abandoned on the roadside, and the entire infrastructure of society collapsing under the weight of military invasion. The speed of the German advance was so shocking, so far beyond what Polish military planners had anticipated, that by the 3rd day of the invasion, German forces were already deep into Polish territory, and the Polish military found itself unable to establish any coherent defensive lines, or to conduct the orderly retreat that might have preserved its forces for a longer resistance. General Władysław Rydz-Przemysl, the Polish commander-in-chief made the decision to evacuate the government and military command from Warsaw and attempt to establish a defense further east. But even as he made this decision, the German encirclement was closing around the Polish forces, turning what might have been an orderly fighting retreat into a desperate flight through an increasingly hostile landscape. The first 10 days of the war also introduced the world to the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, which followed in the wake of the German armies, identifying and executing Polish intellectuals, military officers, priests, and anyone deemed a threat to Nazi rule or an obstacle to the implementation of the horrifying vision of racial subjugation that would become the true character of Nazi occupation. On September 5th, just 4 days after the invasion began, the German army reached the outskirts of Warsaw itself, shocking observers who had believed the city could hold out for weeks if not months. The rapid collapse of Polish resistance was so profound that it forced a complete rethinking of military strategy among both Germany's enemies and its potential allies, demonstrating that the old methods of warfare were obsolete and that armies equipped with modern tanks, aircraft, and coordinated tactics could achieve victories that would have seemed impossible in previous conflicts. The city of Warsaw, which would endure a brutal siege before finally falling, became the symbol of Polish resistance and suffering during these first 10 days. Civilians constructed barricades, attempted to resist the German advance, and faced bombardment and shelling with a courage that could not match German military might, but that would be remembered long after the war as evidence of Polish determination to resist fascism. Inside the German High Command, the speed of success created almost disbelief. Even Hitler, who had confidence in his military's capabilities, was astonished at the efficiency with which the Polish state was being dismantled, and this success would reinforce his conviction that the Western powers were weak, decadent, and incapable of sustained resistance, a catastrophic misreading of British and French resolve that would ultimately prove to be his undoing. The wider world watched these events with growing horror and recognition that the rules-based international system had failed, that aggressive war was now possible against smaller nations, and that the democracies that might have opposed this expansion would do so only at tremendous cost. In America, the news of the invasion sparked urgent debates about neutrality and preparedness, while in Britain and France, the grim realization set in that a long and terrible war was now beginning, one that would demand total mobilization and sacrifice from entire populations in a way that previous wars had not. On September 8th, the German armies surrounding Warsaw tightened their noose, and Hitler, believing victory was within his grasp, began planning not just the military defeat of Poland, but its complete elimination as a nation-state, and the implementation of policies that would reshape the ethnic and racial composition of the conquered territory, according to Nazi ideological principles. Plans that would include the establishment of ghettos, the deportation of Polish populations, and ultimately, the Holocaust. The Polish military, despite the catastrophic strategic situation, continued to fight with remarkable courage in scattered battles and desperate defensive positions, refusing to surrender the capital city despite the hopelessness of the situation. A defiance that would characterize Polish resistance throughout the war, and that would ultimately help the Polish nation survive as a cultural and national entity despite the horrors inflicted upon it. The first 10 days of World War II thus represented not merely a military victory, but a complete transformation of European politics, a demonstration that the old order had failed, that aggressive military powers could reshape the map of Europe through force of arms, and that the conflict that was now beginning would require a level of mobilization, sacrifice, and commitment that exceeded anything the world had previously experienced. It showed that this would not be a war fought between armies on distant battlefields, while civilians remained largely protected, but rather a total war that would consume entire societies, and that would blur the distinction between combatants and non-combatants in a way that would define the Second World War as fundamentally different from all previous conflicts. In the halls of power in London and Paris, leaders grappled with the reality that they had declared war on Germany, but lacked the ability to immediately aid Poland or to deliver the devastating blow to German industry and military capacity that might have shortened the conflict. They faced the prospect of a long, grinding war of attrition against an enemy that had just demonstrated military capabilities that seemed to exceed their own, and the knowledge that millions of their own citizens would be called upon to sacrifice everything in the struggle that lay ahead. The technological and tactical innovations that Germany unleashed in these first 10 days, the coordination of air power and ground forces, the use of armored breakthrough, the psychological warfare conducted against civilian populations, would echo throughout the war and would force other nations to rapidly adapt their military structures and strategies or face defeat indeed. The speed and comprehensiveness of the German victory over Poland would convince Hitler and his generals that they could achieve similar success against France and Britain, a confidence that would ultimately lead to catastrophic miscalculations and overreach. As September 8th turned to September 9th, and the first full week of the war concluded, the magnitude of what had occurred was becoming clear. Not just that Poland would be defeated, but that the entire character of warfare had changed. That technology and coordinated military planning could overcome the advantages of defensive positioning, and that the next phase of the conflict, the showdown between Germany and the Western powers, would determine the future of human civilization itself. The world had entered a new age, one defined by total war, by the deliberate targeting of civilian populations as instruments of strategy, by the mobilization of entire national economies toward military production, and by ideological conflict between incompatible visions of human society. The democracies of the West, with their commitment to individual liberty and representative government, now faced an implacable enemy that believed in racial hierarchy, authoritarian rule, and the conquest and subjugation of inferior peoples. And the struggle between these visions would require the total commitment of resources, lives, and will by both sides. In these first 10 days, the seeds of horrors yet to come were sown. The Holocaust, that would claim 6 million Jewish lives, had its genesis in the conquest of Polish territory and the racial policies that Nazi occupation authorities began implementing. Immediately, the carpet bombing of civilian cities that would characterize the war's later stages was pioneered in the Luftwaffe's assault on Polish cities, and the partisans and resistance movements that would emerge throughout occupied Europe were born in these early days as individuals recognized that Nazi occupation meant not merely military defeat, but the fundamental denial of human dignity and national existence. The Polish people, who had only just regained their independence 2 decades earlier, after centuries of foreign domination, now faced conquest by 2 totalitarian powers that would divide their nation between them and subject their population to horrors that would claim the lives of 6 million Poles, roughly 17% of the entire population, making Poland's suffering during the Second World War proportionally more severe than almost any other nation. By September 10th, when the first 10 days of the war officially concluded, Poland's military situation was hopeless. Its air force had been destroyed, its armies were in retreat or surrounded, its capital city was under siege, and foreign invasion from both east and west meant that no escape and no relief was possible. All that remained was for the military to make the most honorable retreat possible, and for the civilian population to endure the occupation and oppression that would follow, a burden that they would bear with remarkable resilience and dignity throughout the long years of war that lay ahead. The international response to the German invasion shocked the world in its own way. Britain and France had finally abandoned the policy of appeasement that had defined the previous years, but their declaration of war could not immediately translate into military action that might save Poland. And this disconnect between the political decision to resist and the military ability to do so immediately would characterize much of the early war. As the British and French struggled to mobilize their economies and populations for a conflict that many still hoped might be resolved through negotiation rather than total war. In the United States, the invasion of Poland triggered urgent discussions about the implications of German aggression. If Poland could be conquered so quickly and completely, what was to stop Germany from eventually threatening American interests? The American public remained reluctant to enter another European war, haunted by the memories of American sacrifice in the First World War and skeptical of European entanglements. But political and military leaders understood that the security of America was ultimately linked to the balance of power in Europe, and that a German hegemony over Europe would eventually pose an existential threat to American security and interests. The 10 days from September 1st to September 10th thus represented the crossing of a threshold from which there could be no return. The world had entered the age of total war, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The certainties that had governed international relations for centuries, that small nations might be protected by international law, that wars would be limited in their scope and duration, that civilians would be largely insulated from military conflict, had been shattered by the German invasion of Poland, and in their place emerged a new international order, defined by the doctrine that military might makes right, that nations deemed weak could be conquered by those with superior force, and that the clash of totalitarian and democratic ideologies would be resolved only through a struggle that would demand the complete mobilization of societies and the willingness to sacrifice entire generations to achieve victory. The Polish people, who would suffer more during the Second World War in proportion to their population than almost any other nation, began their ordeal during these first 10 days, and their experience of invasion, occupation, forced labor, genocide, and the destruction of their entire social and cultural structure would become the defining tragedy of the war and a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity and deliberate attempts to erase an entire nation from the face of the earth. As the chaos and violence of those first 10 days gave way to the longer struggle that would characterize the next 5 years of total war, historians would look back on this opening phase and recognize it as the moment when the world fundamentally changed, when the old international order collapsed, and when humanity entered into a struggle that would determine not merely which nations would dominate Europe, but the fundamental question of what kind of civilization humanity would create in the aftermath of the catastrophe that had just begun. The invasion of Poland, achieved in just 10 days, would prove to be merely the opening act of a much longer and more terrible drama, one that would ultimately spread across every continent, involve every major power on Earth, and claim the lives of tens of millions. But it would be remembered as the moment when the world recognized that the old rules no longer applied, that aggressive military powers could reshape the map of the world through force of arms, and that the struggle for human freedom, dignity, and democracy would require sacrifices that no previous generation had been asked to make.